Hi, and welcome to Module 5 of this Pluralsight course named Practical HTML5. In the previous module, we have spent time making sure that our site looks a lot better using the new features added in CSS3. But as you'll hopefully remember, HTML5 is a collection of changes made to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And in this module, we are going to focus on the latter. We're going to add functionality to allow the user to drag content, store content locally on the device, and figure out the location of the user. For this, we are going to use again some built-in libraries which come together with the HTML5 standard. Let us start by taking a look at the outline for this module. We're going to start this module by adding functionality for the shopping cart. Instead of using regular buttons to add a product to the shopping cart, we are going to allow the user to drag a product to the shopping cart. For this, we'll use the newly added drag and drop API. Secondly, we are going to extend the shopping cart so we can save the contents on the local device. Previously, we were pretty limited in what we could store locally. We are going to make use of the new storage options to store the cart contents. Finally, we are going to figure out where the user is physically using the geolocation API, also part of the HTML5 standard. So after finishing this module, our web application will be even more functional. We'll have added the ability to drag products to the shopping cart. When the user logs off, he doesn't lose the contents of the cart. Instead, we'll have it saved locally on the system. Finally, the user will also be able to figure out how to drive to the physical Joe's Coffee store, since we find his current location using the new geolocation API. Lots of cool stuff, I think. Let's get started. We're going to start by adding functionality to allow the user to actually buy coffee in Joe's Coffee store. We so far have created the pages where the user can see the different types of coffee, but we haven't added any functionality to allow adding products to the basket. We're going to do that first. To add this functionality, we are going to allow the user to drag items from the product list to the shopping cart or the basket. And that functionality can be added with a new built-in API, the drag and drop API. I assume you are familiar with the concept of drag and drop. It's an interaction most computer and tablet users are familiar with. It's definitely an interaction which originated in desktop applications, and you now also see it commonly being used in websites. Mail sites such as Gmail or Outlook.com have for years allowed the user to pick up an email and drop it in a particular folder. Just like many things we already covered, drag and drop wasn't possible before without the help of an external library. For the purpose of drag and drop, very commonly jQuery was used. Of course, other alternatives were also possible. With the introduction of HTML5, we now have out-of-the-box support for this way of interacting with content. Drag and drop is part of the native HTML5 implementation and is therefore widely supported in modern browsers. The API is pretty straightforward and is based on a system of events, a couple of new attributes we add on the elements, and the data transfer object. Before we add drag and drop to our site, let's start by taking a look at how these new items work in the next couple of slides. And we'll start with the new attributes. There are two new attributes we can add on elements on our pages. The first one, draggable, is used to mark an element as a possible draggable element. An element becomes draggable when we specify the value of draggable to be true. Being draggable means that the browser will allow the user to perform a drag operation with that element. We can use this attribute on just about all elements. It's not limited to a particular type of element. If we set the value to auto, the browser will use its default implementation. One thing to note here is that most browsers make some elements draggable by default. This includes images, text selections, and a couple more. The second attribute is the drop zone attribute. While you'd think you need this to mark an element as a place to allow dropping other elements, you're actually wrong. It is not needed for implementing drag and drop. In fact, at the time of the creation of this course, this attribute is not supported in any major browser, so we won't spend any time looking at it. Next to the new attributes, we also get with the API a number of new events, and we need to wire up these events to actually implement the drag and drop operation. We'll add these events in the upcoming demo, but let's take a quick look at them now already. Typically, once we have an element which can be dragged, we start the drag operation with the drag start event. In this method, we'll typically apply a style on the dragged elements to indicate we are actually dragging them. Secondly, we can add support for the drag enter, drag over, and drag leave events. These are again mostly events we can use to give a visual indication about where the user is dragging an element. For example, we can make sure that an element lights up when it is over a drop zone. To complete the drag operation, we also need to add support for the drop and the drag end events. And in these events, we first need to make sure that we prevent the browser from performing its default action, which is redirecting the user to another page. We can do so by calling the prevent default method, as you can see in the sample code. If we would use only the attributes and events, we still wouldn't end up with a working drag and drop operation. There's a third building block, and that is the data transfer object. It's actually the workhorse of the drag and drop operation, since it can be used to set the data to drag in the drag start and make that data available in the drop event. In the sample code we see here, you can already see that we are using a number of properties and methods of this object in the handler function for the drag start. In the drop handler, we are using the data transfer object to get the data which was dragged. The data transfer object exposes a number of properties and methods, like I just mentioned. The drop effect property is a property which is used to specify what will be the type of drag and drop operation. Along with this, it will also define which cursor will be shown while we are dragging the content. The value of this property should always be a value of the effect allowed enumeration, which can be copy, move, link, or none. It's possible to drag a list of files as well. These are set in the files property. And the types property can be used to store a list of format types of the data, which is stored in the data transfer object. Next to properties, we also have a number of methods on the data transfer object. Using the set data, we can indicate which data we want to put in the data transfer object. So what will be the data we're dragging basically? When using the set data, we need to specify the format, which is the MIME type, and then in data, the actual data. Using the get data, we can, get the data for a given type. And using clear data, we can remove the data for a given type or delete all data at once if we do not specify a type. The set drag image method can be used to set another image to be shown during the drag, and you see that here in the sample code. The add element finally is used to specify the drag source, which defaults to the element being dragged. In this demo, we are going to use the drag and drop API in our site. In this demo, we are going to add support for drag and drop in the shopping cart. And I'm going to do that by using the new drag and drop API, which is of course a JavaScript-based API. I'm going to start by adding a new script file in my scripts folder, and I'm going to call that drag and drop. In the All Coffees page, which is the page I'm going to use, I'm going to add a reference to this file, and in Visual Studio I can simply do that by dragging the script file into my head. Now we're going to have to create some JavaScript. I'm going to start by opening my JavaScript file, and I'm going to start by adding a function called add drag and drop handlers, which doesn't receive any parameters. There we go. So I'm not going to be doing all the typing because it's quite a lot of code and it's very error prone when typing. So I'm going to do some copy pasting of some snippets. The end result that we're going to be working towards is that the user can pick up the image of the coffee in the All Coffees page and drag that onto the shopping cart. And that will then add that coffee to the shopping cart. First, I'm getting hold of all the coffee images by doing a document get elements by class name, product article white, which are the actual images of coffees. Next, I also need a reference to the shopping cart, and I'm going to call that shopping cart drop zone using the document get element by ID passing in shopping cart, which is a div on which I can drop my coffee images. Now inside that shopping cart, I have a UL, and I'm gonna get hold of the UL by using document query selector all, passing in a selector shopping cart space UL, so the child of shopping cart of type UL. Now that I have all the elements I want to work with, I'm going to add some functionality. What I'm going to do next is make sure that each image in the coffee images array here listens for being dragged. So I'm going to add a for loop that loops through the coffee images. And on each coffee image, I'm going to attach, using the add event listener, a listener to listen for the drag start event. And whenever that drag start event fires, this function is going to execute. In here, I get hold of the data transfer object, and I'm going to say that I'm going to do a copy, and very importantly, I'm also going to set data onto the data transfer object. This is the key text, and the data is the ID of the coffee image I'm dragging. This is very important, since this way, when I drop the image, I actually gonna know which image was selected. I'm also going to attach an event onto the shopping cart drop zone, the div that is. And I'm going to use the drag over, and I'm going to say that if there is a default event being fired, cancel that, prevent it from happening. I'm also going to say that the drop effect should be copy. And now I'm going to implement the actual dropping of an image. So again, on the shopping cart drop zone, I'm going to also attach another event listener, in this case for the drop event. And so this function will then execute whenever I drop something onto my div. The first thing I do here is from the data transfer object, I'm going to try to fetch the data that is associated with the key text, which was in this case an ID for an element. So I'm going to get hold of that element by searching the DOM for that element using the get element by ID, passing in this coffee ID. At this point, my page basically knows which element was dragged and dropped, but there's no visual feedback, so I'll have to do that myself. And for this, I'm going to write the add coffee to shopping cart function in just a second, passing in the element as well as the coffee ID. Let's add that function. Now in this function, I'm going to start by creating a string HTML, and this string is composed out of the ID space, and then from the item, so the actual element, I'm going to try to fetch the price, which is currently in the data-price attribute. Then I'm going to create a new li element, so a list item element. And I'm going to set its HTML, so using the inner HTML property, to my created HTML. And finally, I'm going to append that li using the append child function onto the shopping cart, which was actually the UL that I grabbed earlier. At this point, my script is ready. Let us now call it from the All Coffees page. So here at the bottom, I'm going to use the document add event listener again that says when the DOM is loaded, call my add DND handlers function. Let's run this. So at this point the shopping cart is empty. I click on an image and I start dragging it. It cannot be dropped here, but as you see, when I drag over the shopping cart, the pointer is changing into that copy handler. And I drop it and automatically the coffee is added to my shopping cart. At this point though, when I refresh the page, this is gone again. In the next demo, we'll fix that.